What is up, engine heads? Today it's time to review and explain another novel, allegedly revolutionary engine design, and our subject today is the Avadi engine that you can see right here. A very unique, very interesting design. We have two crankshafts, two connecting rods for one piston, and the entire cylinder rotates. And today, as always, we are going to explain why was it designed this way, what are the advantages of this design, as well as the drawbacks and the weaknesses. And of course, we're going to discuss the potential for this design to actually enter mass production. So let's get started. Now, the first thing that came to my mind when I saw this engine was, hey, this is kind of like a gyroscope, because when you think about it, the cylinder rotates, and then the two crankshafts rotate within the cylinder as the cylinder rotates. So kind of like a gyroscope. Okay, that's fun. But why? Because there really is no inherent benefit for the engine in terms of performance or efficiency or weight or size or really anything significant when you make the cylinder rotate. So why would you do it? To answer the why, all we have to do is observe the how. So how did they make the cylinder rotate? The answer is with gears. So as you can see, each of the crankshafts has a gear attached to it. As the crankshafts rotate, the gears rotate and travel along a fixed stationary ring gear. The fixed ring gear is attached to the outer casing of the engine. Because the fixed gear doesn't move, and the crankshafts travel along it with their gears, it makes the entire cylinder rotate instead. And the torque output of the engine is actually on a shaft attached that is part of the cylinder. So the entire cylinder rotates at the same RPM as the output RPM of the engine. This is our torque and output RPM. So why do it with gears? Because if you want to make something rotate in relation to anything else, there are simpler, cheaper, and even more efficient ways than gears. Because gears, they add substantial mass to a system. They also add friction. So why gears? If we look at the website of Avadi and some of their other online sources, you will see how they claim that the gearing allows the engine to increase its torque output. And yes, that is certainly true, because manipulating gearing and gear ratios does allow you to manipulate the torque output of an engine. If we take two gears, we're going to take the same gear sizes and relationships as in the Avadi engine. So if we take two gears, a small gear and a large gear, and if we say that the small gear is half the size of the large gear, then we have a 2-to-1 gear ratio. Now in the Avadi, our small gear is 20 teeth and our large gear is 40 teeth. So 2-to-1 gear ratio. What that does is that if we have an input RPM of, let's say, 1000 RPM at the input gear, then our output RPM at the large gear is going to be halved. It's going to be 500 RPM, of course, because due to twice as large of a circumference in the large gear can only make one revolution while the small gear makes two. So output speed is halved. But the larger circumference of the large gear also means that we have twice the leverage between the output, the center of the gear, and the teeth. And this gives us twice the torque. So if input torque is, let's say, 50 Newton meters at the small gear, then output torque is going to be 100 Newton meters at the large gear. So yes, the gearing present in the heart of the Avadi engine does increase torque, but so too does any geared transmission ever made, because of course all geared transmissions work on the same principle. That's how they manipulate torque output and output speeds of a vehicle with gears. So why put gears inside the engine when you will have to attach a gear transmission to it probably anyway? And also, if you really just wanted to increase the torque output, why just double it? Why go to a 2-to-1 gear ratio when you can quintuple the torque output with a 5-to-1 gear ratio? So Avadi's explanation doesn't quite make sense to me, because they're not answering why they're going for a 2-to-1 gear ratio. Well, the answer to that question lies in the very operating nature of the four-stroke reciprocating piston internal combustion engine. To answer why the Avadi engine is geared like this, why 2-to-1, why the cylinder rotates, we just have to ask ourselves, what else in a four-stroke engine has a 2-to-1 gear ratio, or ratio? They don't have to be gears. Think about it. What else does one revolution and something else in relation to it, connected to it, does 2 revolutions? Yes, it's the crankshaft and the camshaft. The crankshaft and the camshaft in a four-stroke engine, they have a 2-to-1 ratio. For every single revolution of the crankshaft completes 2 revolutions within the same amount of time. 2-to-1 ratio. This has to be done because the four-stroke engine needs 720 degrees, or 2 times 360 degrees, to complete one full combustion cycle. Each stroke, intake, compression, combustion, and exhaust, is one piston top to bottom or bottom to top, and each stroke is 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation. Now, the catch is that you want the intake valves, which are operated by the camshaft, and the exhaust valves, also operated by either the same or another camshaft, you want them to be open only during their respective strokes. You want the intake valves open only during the intake stroke and closed during all the other strokes. You want the exhaust valves open only during the exhaust stroke and closed during all the other strokes. And that means that what you have to do to achieve this is that you have to convert 1/2 of crankshaft rotation into 1/4 of camshaft rotation. You have to convert 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation into 90 degrees of camshaft rotation. And a 2-to-1 gear ratio does exactly that. And once you have done that, all you need to do is size and position the camshaft lobe accordingly so that it opens the desired valves only during the desired strokes. And the other 3/4 of the camshaft's rotation, the valve will be closed. And you do the same for the intake and the exhaust, and voila, you have a properly working four-stroke engine. But if we go back to the Avadi, we are going to observe that this engine does not have valves or camshafts or valve springs or cam lobes, none of that. In fact, it has one of the simplest valve trains you're ever going to observe on any engine, because the valve train of the Avadi consists of nothing other than 3 holes. That's it. We have the inner rotating cylinder, and in it there is 1 hole. The outer fixed casing on it has 2 holes. As the inner cylinder rotates, the hole aligns at certain times with one of the holes of the outer fixed cylinder. When the holes align, air is allowed to either enter or exit from the chamber, from the engine. When the holes don't align, the chamber is sealed and air cannot get in or out. Now, what the gears in the engine and the 2-to-1 gear ratio do is that they convert 180 degrees of crankshaft rotation of the engine into 90 degrees of cylinder rotation. So what essentially becomes of the cylinder is that each quarter of the cylinder is 1 stroke. So all you have to do is position your holes accordingly and get them to match at the correct time for the correct stroke. And gears ensure this because gears create a constant and consistent rotation relationship between the position of the piston and the position of the cylinder in relation to the outer casing. So this is why the cylinder rotates, and this is why we have the gears, because they allow this extremely simple valve train to function. And this extremely simple valve train, which doesn't have a big heavy cylinder head or a lot of moving parts or takes up a lot of space, is the reason why this engine is so lightweight and so compact. The Avadi is a air-cooled 250cc engine which weighs only around 10 kilograms. And there is, as far as I know, no equivalent conventional four-stroke engine of 250cc that weighs 10 kilograms. They all weigh a bit more, some weigh a lot more. So what was actually done is that complexity was added to the bottom end to allow great simplicity and weight reduction in the top end in the valve train of the engine. But that is not the only benefit of employing this system. There are some other very fortunate consequences of the anatomy of the Avadi engine. The main benefit of the Avadi anatomy is that it has greatly improved balance compared to a conventional single-cylinder design. Let's first observe the conventional design to understand how the Avadi is better. As you know, in a conventional single cylinder, we're going to have one piston, one rod, one crank. The piston goes up and down, it has a mass, accelerates, decelerates constantly, rapidly, so we have a force constantly doing this that must be balanced out if we want to prevent massive vibrations to the engine. We can try and do this in a conventional design with the crankshaft counterweight. At top and bottom, the crankshaft counterweight, top and bottom dead center, the crankshaft counterweight can balance the piston mass out if we make the mass of the counterweight equal to the mass of the piston. But the problem is that at 90 and 270 degrees, the crankshaft counterweight points in a direction completely different to the direction of the movement of the piston, so it can't balance anything out, and instead the counterweight creates a side-to-side rocking and vibration of the engine, and we have really solved nothing. We just moved the up and down vibration, converted it into a side-to-side vibration with the crankshaft counterweight, so this doesn't work. What we can try is to add a balance shaft to the single-cylinder design, the conventional design, and a balance shaft is simply a shaft rotating together, geared to the crankshaft, or otherwise rotating together with the crankshaft, and on it has an offset weight which can balance out something. Now, what we're going to do is that we're going to make the crankshaft counterweight 50% the mass of the piston, and the balance weight is going to be the other 50% of the piston mass. So at top and bottom dead center, as before, the crankshaft counterweight now together with the balance weight balances out the piston. But at 90 and 270 degrees of rotation, the balance weight is now balancing out the crankshaft counterweight. So we have improved the balance, but we have not made it ideal. Because if we go back to top and bottom dead center, you can see how underneath the piston, in the line of the piston, we have a net downward force. Because the crankshaft counterweight balances out only 50% of the piston mass, so 50% still remains, and there's a net downward force. On the other side, in the line or above the balance weight, we have a net upward force. So we have these two forces of equal magnitude and opposite directions, so they should cancel each other out and restore balance. Yes, but the problem is that they are separated by an offset, a physical distance. And when you have an object and you apply forces of equal magnitude, opposite directions, separated by a distance, you get what's known as a rocking couple. You're essentially trying to flip the object over. You can easily try this yourself with any sort of object. You're going to see how it works. It's pretty intuitive. So we have improved the balance with a balance shaft, but we also have another new kind of vibration now. The engine is trying to flip over, so balance is not optimal. To get optimal balance with a conventional single cylinder, we actually have to add two balance shafts located on either side of the crankshaft. We make the crankshaft counterweight 50% of the piston mass, and each of the balance weights is now 25% of piston mass. And as you can see at top and bottom dead center, we now do not have a rocking couple, because the distribution of the forces is now even. As before, at 90 and 170 degrees of rotation, the two balance weights balance out the crankshaft counterweight. So, to get perfect balance with a conventional single cylinder, we need 2 balance shafts. By the time you add 2 balance shafts to the engine and the gears and everything needed for them, the bearings and the oiling and whatever, you realize that, first of all, you not only increased the size of the engine, but added complexity and friction to the extent where you could just have made a twin-cylinder engine instead. And this is why 2 balance shafts on single cylinders are not employed very often because of practicality. But if we go to the Avadi now, we're going to see that the 2 crankshafts ensure pretty much perfect balance out of the box. At the top and bottom dead center, each crankshaft counterweight equals 50% of the piston mass, and so together they balance out the piston. At 90 and 270 degrees, the 2 crankshaft counterweights, they balance each other out. So we have pretty much perfect balance. I'm saying pretty much because although the crankshaft counterweights are very, very close to each other, they still have a tiny little bit of distance between them. So if you observe them from above, we can see that there is a bit of a rocking couple here. But as I said, the distance is extremely small. So I think this is pretty much unnoticeable. And for all practical intents and purposes, this is a single-cylinder engine with pretty much perfect balance while being much more compact in its anatomy than a conventional single cylinder with twin balance shafts would be. But the Avadi anatomy has one more benefit: reduced friction. If we observe the conventional design, we can see that when combustion force acts on the piston and pushes it down, the connecting rod is at an angle. Because of this, a part of the mass of the connecting rod is outside the line of the force of the main combustion force and the direction of the movement of the piston. So what happens is when the piston pushes down on the connecting rod is in turn trying to flip over. As it tries to flip over, it pushes the piston against the cylinder wall, thus increasing the friction between the piston and the cylinder and creating increased wear also on what is known as the thrust side of the cylinder. Now, in the Avadi, we don't have this problem because we have 2 rods. So as each rod gets acted on the piston, each rod is trying to flip over in its own direction. So what they do is that they cancel each other out and the piston remains more stable in the bore and we have reduced friction and wear. So far, things look pretty good for the Avadi. We have a design that offers greater compactness and reduced weight compared to a conventional design, while at the same time giving us much better balance and reduced friction. What's not to like? Well, that's what we're talking about next. The things that are not so likable about the Avadi engine, and to see them, we're going to look at the stats, at the specs of the Avadi that we can find on their website. And Avadi claims that their 250cc air-cooled engine makes 15.8 horsepower at 3,700 RPM and 30.2 Newton-meters of torque at 3,500 RPM. And according to Avadi, this makes their engine twice as powerful while having half the weight of the nearest competitor engine. So we have to ask ourselves, what is the nearest equivalent competitor for the Avadi? It is most certainly not a motorcycle engine, because if we take a modern air-cooled, very simple single overhead cam, very inexpensive, a motorcycle with 250cc, we can see that it makes more power than the Avadi. So that is obviously not the nearest competitor engine. Let's look at something a bit more humble. Let's downgrade to find the nearest competitor. Here's the Honda GX270, so a bit more cc than the Avadi. It's a power equipment engine, and if we put the stats, the specs side by side, we can see that this is sort of where the Avadi claim makes sense. Twice the power, half the weight, because this weight of the GX270, it is with the fuel tank and the accessories. I think it's a dry fuel tank, but it's still, there's some mass in it, in the tank itself. So if we drop the accessories in the tank, I think the Avadi claim this is it, twice the power, half the weight. So the nearest competitor is a power equipment engine. Actually, no. The Avadi is beating this typical representative of a power equipment engine only because it's kinda cheating. The specs quoted of the engine by Avadi are at the output shaft. Remember, that is geared down. So quoting numbers at the geared down output shaft of the Avadi would kind of be the same thing as quoting numbers of a conventional engine after the transmission, and nobody does that. We give power at the crankshaft, torque at the crankshaft. And if we do that for the Avadi, remember 2-to-1 gear ratio, we're going to see that the engine actually has to rev to 7,400 RPM to make this kind of power, 15.8 horsepower. And the torque output at the crankshaft is actually around 15 Newton meters of torque. The Avadi is beating the GX only because it revs twice as high. Just like pretty much any other power equipment engine, the GX170 is limited to around 3,600 RPM. The GX at the crank actually makes more torque than the Avadi. Power is torque times RPM. If you rev twice as high with similar torque, you're gonna make more power. But to rev so high to have a 7,400 or more RPM redline, the Avadi needs a lot stronger internals, better materials, better bearings, a much more advanced and expensive oiling system, and overall that makes the engine a lot more expensive. Probably puts it somewhere in the range of cost comparable to a motorcycle engine. So you need motorcycle engine money, but you're gonna get power equipment engine performance. Yeah, nobody wants that. So why is the Avadi performance so poor? Well, the answer is very obvious. We go back to the valve train. The culprit is the valve train. In a conventional engine, we have the entire area of the bore of the engine available for breathing. We can put in 2 intake valves, 2 exhaust valves, so all of the bore area is available for breathing. In the Avadi, only half the bore area is available for breathing. The other half, remember, we need it to keep the cylinder sealed. We cannot put valves or any cavities or holes in the other half of the bore area of the Avadi. So half the breathing capacity area means dramatically reduced performance, and this is inherent to the anatomy. It cannot be improved, which means that the Avadi is destined to have, in this design at least, is destined to have pretty poor performance. The final major drawback of the Avadi is that this design is not scalable. Although Avadi claim it is not. Because remember, the cylinder rotates. If the cylinder rotates, we cannot stack multiple cylinders onto a single crankshaft like we can with a conventional design. For example, a 4-cylinder Avadi engine would have 8 rods, 8 crankshafts, and 12 big gears in it. So really, that is not practical. It would make the engine very complex, far too many moving parts, a lot of friction, and definitely very expensive. So the Avadi is actually scalable only up to the practical displacement of a single-cylinder engine, which is around 800 cc. Anything beyond that, the Avadi doesn't really make sense, which means that in cars, it can only be a range extender. For motorcycles, it can't do anything because even for single-cylinder motorcycles, it's not a good idea because it has the poor power we discussed. What else? For power equipment, it's far too expensive. So what is this engine for? Well, that's actually a very good question, and I think I found the answer after analyzing many different novel engine designs on this channel, and I think the answer is the rise of drone or UAV warfare. I think this is the main driving force behind this recent emergence of so many novel engine designs, because when you think about it, the liquid piston, the in-engine, and now the Avadi, all of them are focused on one thing, and that is to be lightweight and compact, as lightweight, as compact as possible. They really don't beat the conventional design in anything else. Not in performance, not in emissions, not in efficiency, not in reliability for sure, nothing. When you look at the Avadi, for example, the valve train, does it seal the holes? How does it all seal? We know nothing about it, whether it works, but none of that really matters for drones. What is important is for the engine to be as lightweight and as compact as possible. It doesn't even have to last that long because many drones are suicide drones. And what this means is that the rise of this drone warfare around the world has sort of leveled the playing field between engine companies with a lot of know-how and a lot of R&D and new guys in the game. Because drone engines, the engines that are needed for drones, don't really benefit from almost a century of R&D invested in the conventional design, which, as I said, levels the playing field in terms of access to the potential to get funding from the armies. And the armies, they have a lot of money and they are willing to spend it to fund the development of these engines because they're hoping to have better drones than the other armies. So motivated by this prospect to get money from the army, we have new engine designs being developed and we have an attempt to get them to the point where they can be presented to the army in hopes of getting funding. And if we look at all the novel engine designs and how they appeared and how they evolved their presentation online, it's very similar. Usually we have it all starts with this buzz and hype generating phase. We have some sort of simple, crude prototype in this phase. And we have claims like twice the power, half the weight, better in every possible regard, and so on and so forth. Most of these claims are usually half-truths or only true under certain conditions, but they are important because they prepare the field for the next phase, which is usually the crowdfunding phase, where the engine designers are trying to get some sort of initial funds to develop the design a bit further, to just hopefully get it mature enough to present it to the army so that they can apply for the serious funds from the army, which is in the millions or in the tens of millions of dollars. And that is realistically the kind of money you need to get a novel engine design to actual maturity. And when you do your research, it really starts to add up. The Avadi engine was actually designed and developed in the 90s, way back in the 90s by a man called Michel Arsenault, but it was not marketed until just a few years ago when drone warfare became important. The engine was pretty much obscure before that. And because it didn't fit that well with any other applications, but for drones, it might work, so we get a campaign. Also, what's worth noting is that Avadi on their website in the news section now claim that they have abandoned their valve train design because they have seen how it is a limiting factor in terms of performance. I think that was obvious from day one, but they needed that valve train design to give them the initial hype numbers and initial very low weight, and now they're abandoning it in favor of a more performance-oriented design. Also, here they claim on this in this article how they're actually aiming for the army money. So yeah, it all really does add up. So yeah, we'll probably never see this engine in a car or a motorcycle, probably never even in a power equipment application, but we might see it someday in a drone. Even if it happens, we probably won't know about it. It's going to be some confidential stuff or whatever. But despite this, I don't think this makes this engine any less exciting. I think it is a very interesting, very elegant design. And I think analyzing novel engine designs, it is not just fun, but it is very useful because it definitely deepens our understanding of engine mechanics and physics in general. And who knows, it might inspire you to create a novel design of your own and try to get the greens from the greens. Yeah, I'm going to stop right here. That's pretty much it for today. As always, thanks a lot for watching. I'll be seeing you soon with more fun and useful stuff on the D4A channel.